Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be here, and I feel nice and tall this morning. I can see everyone. Can you see me? Okay. It was a wonderful evening last night. We had great dinner. We had great location and great company. I'd like to thank, first of all, our hosts for last evening. It was really, really wonderful. The topic I've chosen for this morning's discussion is about density. Last few days when I came here, arrived here, I was wondering, in this location and this setting, how am I going to talk about density? It just seems too irrelevant given this really wonderful, open, alpine country. Then I thought, referring back to where I come from, Singapore, one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Very dense, small country, 714 square kilometer, 5 million people, with a density of about 7,200 persons per square kilometer. Certainly the study of density is important and is relevant. Relevant not just for us as planners, as researchers, but also for better understanding of policymakers, government people. And also, a quick introduction, my center. We research density. We focus on the dense environments in Asia. We look at issues of space, issues of the greenery, the people, the housing, the transportation systems. And we see them as the interlinked components that make up a sustainable city. And they are all interlocked. When we want to look at urban density, we talk about urban functionality, we talk about livability, we talk about city quality of life. And these are the kind of important aspects. And we look at cities in Asia. I'm sure many of you, if you've not been, would have seen the pictures of the teeming masses in cities like Mumbai, in Kolkata, in Bangkok, in Jakarta. And this is where the most critical and the most serious environmental problems are. But the study of density and sustainability, I want to really, it's a very wide subject, it's wide-ranging, but I really want for this morning to focus on 5 key areas, and I just choose 5 words. One is sustainability. Second, I want to talk about choice. I want to talk about adaptation, adaptability, livability, and finally, well-being. Density and sustainability has been very much in the discourse about sustainability in cities, and most of the time, researchers, scholars have mostly, I would say, generally agreed that high density is a preferred and even necessary development strategy for cities. And there is that thinking that you need that kind of density, you need a kind of compactness in order to achieve certain amount of resource optimization and resource conservation, conserving land, conserving energy. The early researchers, could learn to get used to this. The early researchers, this is Weckenegger and Rees, who specialized in discussing urban metabolism, ecological footprints, tells us that high-density urban living significantly shrinks our per capita ecological footprints by reducing energy and material needs. And they advocate that we should really start looking at how we can harness density and that whole, the collection of people in cities to try to think of how we orientate our thinking towards the community, towards making healthier living conditions. I have to say oops a few times this morning, I think. And this is the famous hyperbole by Peter Newman and Ken Worthy that links density with urban automobile dependency and energy usage. And the hypothesis here is that as cities get more dense, at this level here is the density, the usage of dense energy in terms of per capita for automobile goes down. So if you look at some of the American cities, Atlanta, Houston, and these are the cities, low density, sprawling, spread out with extremely high usage of energy per capita. And you see cities out at this end. So most of the Asian cities are at this end, and of course the European cities are somewhere in the middle. And complexity came out in the early 1990s, and the whole call to say we need to bring back people into cities because the historic centers are so vibrant, so rich, and so full of energy and activity that they are ideal places to develop people to live and work. And this proximity of economic activities will bring about efficiency gains and technological innovation capacity. In the UK, again, that push to say we should densify our cities. In the US, a reaction against the sprawl of the suburbia, and everybody's saying bring back the density to the cities. Manhattanization. And everybody talks about the density of New York, of Manhattan. New York, the most densely populated city in the US, with a density of 10,000 persons per square kilometer. And Manhattan, smaller area of 60 square kilometer, you have 26,000 persons per square kilometer. But everybody is saying, oh, it's wonderful. Everybody loves New York. And this is where all the activities are, all the art, the culture, the innovation, the energy, the buzz. And this is a wonderful article. I use it a lot for my work. No, I'm not talking about Glazer. And it says New York is the greenest city in the US. Somewhat counterintuitive, but it's very anecdotal. This journalist talks about living in the apartments in New York, small apartments. He says, I don't need to go very far to go shopping. I don't need to take a car. I take the subway. My energy bill is very low. My electricity consumption is very low. And everything is within walking distance. Everything is wonderful. It's a utopian community. And then he went on to talk about if he moves up to the suburbs, he has to buy one car and buy another car. He has to travel just a short distance, take the car to get to the grocery shop and things like that. So this is how the dense aspects of Manhattan is just so convenient and so efficient. And so the observable sustainability gains in the economic realms are quite compelling, given that agglomeration of people and wealth have boosted both urban and regional economies with high productivity gains, urban innovations, and enhanced life quality in terms of diversification of people and opportunities for creativity and growth. But look at the work by Harvard economist Glaser. And he's the real advocate of the city. And he says, cities are great, and cities make us more human. I'm not sure if everybody agrees with that. And he said the basic point is that people who live in densities are much more likely, or much less likely, to drive long distance than people who live in lower densities. And he said a single family detached house uses an average of 83% more electricity than urban apartments in the United States. And he talks about creativity and innovation in cities. Cities bring smart people together, and they build on each other in terms of the synergies, in terms of learning from each other. Smart people get smarter when they mix with other people, creative people in the city. And he goes on, and he's a real advocate, the real extolling the wonderful things about high density. And his views are supported by people like Florida, who says creative classes of professionals love the buzz of the city. They like to go to the city. But densification has its detractors. A lot of people are saying, what are we talking about density? It's just a number. And really, it's not important whether you are 75 dwelling units per hectare or you are 20,000 persons per square kilometer. It's really about urban form. It's really about urban functions. It's really about how you piece the different things together to make a good city. It's not about density. It's not about the number. And there are work by people like Tony Lee in MIT, who does all this wonderful density atlas that shows that a single number of density can give you so many numerous permutations in terms of form and in terms of massing. SpaceMate, work done by the TU Delft PhD students, and they actually generate a whole lot of parameters about densities and say you can have very low rise, spread it all over, you can have a single high rise, and it's the same density. So it's just a matter of how you actually configure the different components. So you need to get the hang of this. But so many people still do not agree. There are still a lot of people who do not quite agree that density is going to give us the best quality of life in cities. Thomas Jefferson, he said, it's pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. He's one of those haters of cities. But let's look closer at different densities in cities. Contrasting densities, differentials. At the extreme end, this is the 50 largest cities in the world ranked by population density. At the extreme end there is Mumbai. It's 30,000 persons per square kilometer. And then you have got Karachi, you have got Kolkata, Asian cities. At the middle, you have got some American cities, and right at this end, the blue lines are the European cities. All the red bars are the Asian cities, and most of them are concentrated in the top 20 to 30. Zurich is probably way out of this range here. I don't know where it is. So, high density of cities in Asia. Mumbai, 30,000 persons per square kilometer. If you think about it, London, Moscow, about 6,000. So it's about 5 or 6 times larger than London, Moscow. Densities in Paris is about half that of Bangkok. Shanghai is 6 million people living within 7 square kilometer of radius of 7 kilometers, whereas Paris has the same population within a radius of double that area. And these are the kind of differentials. Asian cities, 20, 30,000 persons per square kilometer, double the rates in Latin America, triple those in Europe, 10 times those in the United States. And we talk about buzz in the city. We talk about how wonderful it is to live in the city. Now we need to see that reality. Okay, Asia and Africa, urbanizing much more rapidly than any other continents today. And they haven't even reached the 50% yet, it's about 42% today. So they are really dense, and the future is going to be even more dense. But what's really interesting is that as the population continues to gravitate to the cities by way of urbanization, different aspects of urbanization. I think it's very interesting actually. So some of it is urban to rural, some from smaller cities to larger cities, some of it is from outside the city to the inner area, some of it is circular, people going back and coming in again. So this is the kind of dynamics that's going on inside the dense cities of Asia. And what's happening is a spatial transformation that's taking place. You see physical changes, but in these cities, the spatial changes relate to a few key areas, a few manifestations. One is the production of consumption spaces. You see all the supermarkets, shopping malls, offices, and the hotels from the old traditional houses, the kind of transformation. You see verticalization, cities shooting upwards, and you see horizontal expansion. This is Shanghai and Beijing. Chinese cities in particular are growing out sideways, and you see the kind of expansion patterns, such that in fact, when you look at it globally, in fact, density is not actually going to increase with the future increase in population. There's likely to be a decline, mainly because there is actually a sideward expansion. But the actual number of persons in cities, of course, is going to go up tremendously. And what you're really seeing is not so much just average density increasing, but it is the kind of form that you see in cities. Mumbai, Delhi, Shanghai, these are the Asian cities, and you can see the peaks in the centers going up. Whereas you look at London, look at some of the other cities, they're very much spread out, more flattened. So it's the spatial, it's the differentiation within cities. So if you see the average density is only 5,000 to 6,000 persons, not too bad, but the concentration is there. There's the enormous peaks especially in the city centers, where the most critical environmental problems are. And these are some of the issues that we are faced with. The UN Habitats report says that the growth of Asian cities is not environmentally sustainable. And they talk about the ecological footprint. A lot of the growth in cities, in Asian cities, is driven by consumption, and less so by industrialization and production. And so you see increase in the ecological footprint, air pollution. As many as half a million people die of respiratory-related diseases in Asia every year, and food supply, energy, water, all these are critical issues. So choice. Do people have a choice? The kind of environment they live in. So scholars, like all of us, we start talking about what form it would take. We talk about city bus, we talk about, urban strategies. But really, an important question is, what is your chosen strategy or pathway to direct these cities towards the future, to create more livable communities? But whose livability? How do we define it? How are we going to discuss livability in this kind of context? Dharavi, Mumbai, was talked about on the first day. 1 million people living in this kind of condition. Kowloon Wall City, this has now been demolished. It's 1993. But at the time when it was there, it was the most densely populated area on Earth. The residents don't even see the sunlight. And the population was a staggering 1.9 million persons per square kilometer. And this is the kind of densities we're talking about in Asia. So what do we do? I'm so sorry, this thing is like, now, what are the kind of urban strategies? So different cities have their different ways of dealing with it. Hong Kong has almost the same density as Singapore, but actually it's a lot more dense in terms of net density because a huge amount of its area cannot be built upon. It's a lot of hilly areas. And its response is high-rise, go vertical. And this is the tapestry of the facades in the high-rise buildings. Architecture of density, stacks and stacks and stacks. And when you look at it, they don't look too bad. They're in fact quite pretty, in fact. You know, you can make a nice picture, a wall picture with them. But the reality is that behind the pretty facade, living space per person on a square kilometer is 12.5 square meters per person. Each person has that tiny little cubicle. Behind the facade is that teeming humanity that these people cram together into these little cubicles. And this is the reality. And this is the kind of response that Hong Kong decided to take up. China, in recent years, have taken a different approach and said we want to build new cities. And I think this was discussed on day before yesterday. All the so-called new eco-cities. Dependency on technology, green cars, green buildings, building brand new buildings in the swamp areas outside the city, and some of them in the inner parts of the city. But we asked the question, can these new eco-cities solve the problems of density within these cities? Some of them, the new one by Singapore-China collaboration, Tianjin Eco-City, 30,000 people. How many of these cities do you need to accommodate the population of, say, Shanghai? China, with its population of over 1 billion people, how are you going to address those issues by building this number of these eco-cities in different parts of the country? And this approach has been criticized, and everybody's saying, that's not good enough. It's superficial, just depending on technology. It's very much this whole utopian ideal of necessary utopianism, and just a kind of a wish to just get away from the existing environment, try to do something differently, and don't think too much about what's happening in terms of the real world in the current cities. And that's not going to work. It's not going to help us to solve those problems. So now let's look at Singapore. This is the prettier picture of Singapore, not the one I showed earlier. And this is the image that we present to the world and say, look at Singapore, we're doing very well, small country, large population, and yet it looks quite nice. It's green, it's got modern buildings, it's got all these wonderful art, performing art, and it's got all these things. But how do we address the issues of density? And the government, very similar to Hong Kong, decided to build these new towns. Over the island, 23 new towns spread out in this format, or rather spread out in this ring around the center in this form. High-rise, mostly high-rise, and again, stacking up, vertical, but with some amount of greenery around it. And this is what we call planned high-rise, high-density. And the approach is actually Slightly different from Hong Kong, mainly because the building was at a higher density, but the space around is pretty much being looked after in terms of landscapes and in terms of the openness of the space around. And so you get this situation where people live in smaller apartments, they are packed up into the building, so once they step out, they get the greenery and the open space around. Density, very high. Average density of these towns, these are all the listed, the 23 towns, we're talking about 17,000. On average, about 20,000 persons per square kilometer. But that's the gross density. That means take the whole town, take the total population. The net density is most of the time double that. Net meaning just take the residential area. And 40,000. Just now, when I mentioned Mumbai, we talk about 30,000. So that is the kind of comparison. And these towns are not mature. Most of them have still got some more to go. That means it's an ongoing process. And the ultimate densities are even higher. 20 to 30,000 on gross, and about 50 to 60,000 on net densities. And this is the kind of towns we are building for our people. But it's interesting because they're all planned. So there's a certain formula, there's a certain approach to planning using what is known as the neighborhood, a very almost like town planning 101 in school, where you draw a plan, you put in the neighborhood centers, you put in the town centers. But somehow it works, where you have, everybody has a town center where you have all the amenities, your shopping, your schools, your polytechnics, and then at the lower level you have the neighborhood, so you buy your day-to-day needs. And so this is the kind of a formula that's been used and repeated endlessly in all the 20 over new towns spread out in the country. And how do we mitigate? As I said, we put in all these green spaces, we try to put in some landscapes and vary the heights, still is the same. And I asked the question, livability and lovability. It's not good enough to be livable, it's just amenities. Do people love the town? Do people like living in them? How do you make these towns communities? How do you make the housing homes, jobs? How do you make shelters become comfortable, to give comfort, safety? And how do you make the neighbors friends? And I think that is more important than just the physical features. And when you look at the lower level, at where the people are, and this is what you see, the food centers. And there's where people sit around, drink their morning coffee, and eat their rotis. And people walk around these estates in their comfortable clothes. This is Singapore's national costume, national dress, t-shirts and shorts. And this is what I say is comfortable because people feel at home. This is where they live. This is what they do all the time anyway. And this is the kind of life. The older people, they queue up for food in the food centers. They sit down, have coffee with their friends. And the shops. This is where people mingle, buy their food. And not just their food, this is the religious paraphernalia, joss-sticks for their gods. And that is what living is about. The whole aspects of your day-to-day life. People grow up and people grow old in these places. They play, they eat, they make friends. The bottom row of these of the vertical flats are these horizontal spaces of eating, of mingling, of a contemporary interpretation of the traditional shop house. And shops are the life of people. They like to shop. Singaporeans love to shop, they love to eat, and this is the ordinary day-to-day life. So what next? Do we continue with this formula for the future? The future city we talk about? What do we do? So in our center, we do a lot of this sort of research. And some of the things are very technical. We look at wind, we look at solar, we look at daylight, and we say sky view. We do these computer architectural simulations. We try to make sure that even in high density, people have certain good environmental conditions. But more than that, we try to look at people. And we say people matters. What do they think? How do they feel? And so what Christian was saying earlier, we try to do these surveys, we walk into people's flats and talk to them and ask questions. And these are some of the quotations. This come out of a focus group discussion we had with a group of them. One evening we sat down till about 11 o'clock at night with my sociologist from my Faculty of Arts. And they said, we asked them, how do you feel? They said, oh, it's too hot, but I open my doors and windows and put the fans on. And they say, it's too crowded, but it's better to be crowded because I feel safe, which is interesting because they said, there are people walking around. I'm not alone, and I know that less chances of crimes happening. And they said, well, at least if I live on a higher floor, I can see a bit of the sky. And we asked them about the noise. They say, oh yeah, it's noisy, but I'm used to it. So there's a certain adaptation, and people get used to some of these things. And we asked them, neighbors. And they said, oh yeah, we get to know our neighbors. And they tell these little stories about, this old lady who has a heart problem breathing. And immediately the daughter called me and I drove her to the hospital. And we said, wow, that's great. And he said, oh, they could have asked for an ambulance, but it's faster if I get into the car and I drive her there. And they value neighborliness. They value the fact that the people are close by, that they can get help. And my friend said, you are a good neighbor. I gave him a pat on the back. And places of neighboring. Familiar places, where are they? They are where the lift lobbies are. They ran into each other and they say hello. And they know that this is a familiar face. This guy lives in the same block. And these are the more, we call them the places of deliberate neighboring. We create spaces for people to meet, but it is the spontaneous meetings that are important. They say, you enter the lift, you press the same floor, and you ask, oh, you're living on the same floor. They say, hi, I'll see you again next time. So that is the kind of neighboring that's happening. So there is a fair amount of learning, acceptance, and adaptability. And these are some of the conclusions. They said, we're happy living here. Our expectations are not very high. And this guy says, I just want to go home to a relaxed environment at the end of the day. I want to just be at home. And this last guy says, oh, got greenery lah. I'll be very happy. This Singaporeans speak. And people treasure and love their greenery. Okay, oops. Okay, and so there is this amount of change and adaptation. And I call it a kind of a planned process of urbanization, where we move people into these places, we give them an environment that they can grow up in. It's a process of social change where that familiarity becomes part of what they live with. It's an evolving community, and it's ordinary people living ordinary lives, but it's far from homogeneous. Everybody says it looks the same, But when you go behind it and you talk to them, I have my students living in these houses, on these flats, and they come to school, they wear their earrings, they dye their hair orange, and they all have different ways of expressing themselves. And this is the kind of environment they live and grow up in. And I don't think we are that badly off in terms of the bringing up of the next generation of our people. But what next to the future? We're going to increase the population. Today we are 5 million, and chances are that it will go beyond that. Glaser, the guy I spoke of, a Harvard economist, came to Singapore, and they asked him, what do you think if Singapore were to have a 6.5 million population? And he says, density is underrated, undervalued, and the pleasures of density are in fact quite remarkable. He says, we should have more density. Nothing wrong with 6.5 million. It's great. It's good for you. That's what he said. It was quoted in the Straits Times, which is our local newspaper, 25th of March, 2009. And the next day, you get all these, this is what he said earlier, built them up, and he gets all these responses. These are letters to the newspaper. Who wants a densely packed Singapore? And this guy, these are all people who just write to the newspapers, and they said, high density will serve people's needs, but don't forget that people want privacy and comfort and space. This is another guy who says, be wary of potential pitfalls. Densities in this kind of dense environment compartmentalize people. It minimizes social interaction. It causes people to be alienated. And then when I read this, I thought of what Jane said the other day about the Red Road block, and I said, oh no, these are some of the things that people are concerned about, they're worried about. And they said they're happy now, but they don't want it to increase any further in the future. Pack them in? No, it will spoil our lifestyle today. The last phrase, he says, and it was quite funny because I read through this again yesterday, and I highlighted this. This guy says, I thought the aspiration was for a Swiss standard of living and not a Hong Kong manner of living. We all love the Swiss. We say we all want to have the Swiss standard of living. And they say, Singapore still has an enviable lifestyle. It might not be the case when it becomes overpopulated. And this is like what people are saying. It's okay now, but don't pack in more. We are at a point where we are quite comfortable. But this is what we call this is the green space. We talk about, everybody says, Singapore is so green. And I think this is a wonderful asset that we have. I'm a member of the National Parks Board, and I'm very, very proud of our green spaces. And we have this wonderful green heart in the heart of the city. We have the reservoirs, we have the people who can actually go out there and walk through the parks and the nature areas. But once you start increasing the density, some of these may have to go. And this is the population conundrum. I was recently involved in a study with the Institute of Public Policy, and we've been looking at scenarios in the future. What if we're going to increase the density to 6.5, 7, or whatever? What will happen? What kind of densities are we looking at? How much of the green spaces do we have to sacrifice? But I think that kind of discussion is still very linear because we still don't think in terms of, there's other aspects, multifunctionality, layering, and there's many different ways of dealing. This is a little bit linear, but it's still a good start to start thinking about the future. And we say, okay, what if you increase, and these are kind of new densities that we talk about. I won't go into the detail. This is just really some of the permutations that we did. All right. So, most of the new density will be, or most of the new population will be located in the new towns, and you get enormous changes in the existing environment. The red is the existing and the new will be the green areas. So there'll be that kind of change in the future. And of course, we are worried about the future. All right. You won't be able to read it, but I'm waiting for it to change. Yes. So, this is a newspaper article that came out, not in Singapore. I was traveling and I picked up a copy from a neighboring country. And it says, Singapore is already showing signs of urban stress. And that's not a very favorable report, but highlights some of the issues. Train squeeze. We even have flooding recently. We have people cramming into the trains, we have traffic jams in the morning. And this guy says, it's crowded, it's very crowded. So ultimately, I think we are really talking about well-being and quality of life. And I like this quote a lot. It says, a city's quality of life is more important than business response to a particular business need, which will probably have limited success when you encourage firms to expand or attract new firms if they are not part of a comprehensive effort to improve the quality of life in the city for its residents. And most of the time people talk about QOL, they talk about bringing talents into the city, bringing them in, but we forget that it is the real quality of life of the people who are living in these cities. And last week when I was in Naples attending the World Urban Conference, we talked about well-being. I actually presented some of our results of our benchmark studies. Well, we said, okay. And we say, okay, you want to look at well-being, there's so many things that you need to look at. There's population, there's healthcare, there's education, there's housing provision, not just in terms of density, but also in terms of affordability, in terms of housing standard, the floor space per person. There's well-being and safety, there's income distribution, social cohesion, sense of community, social trust, spatial segregation. And these are the kind of issues that we need to address, not just the numbers, whether it's 30,000 or 50,000. These are the key areas that we need to look at. We ask our students, what's your future city? And these are the kind of drawings that they show us. They want to grow food between the blocks of houses. These are some of the images of our students. They want to have biofuel. They want to have, underneath the expressways, we grow algae for biofuel. It's wonderful things that they do. And so at the end of it all, where do we go from here? What is the future like? And I think it's really important to make the right choices, the right decisions. Because once you take a particular pathway, there's no going back. And I like Italo Calvino's little stories, this one in particular. Marco enters a city. He sees someone in a square living a life or an instant that could be his. He could now be in that man's place if he had stopped in time long ago, or if long ago at the crossroads. Instead of taking one road, he had taken the opposite one. And after long wandering, he had come to be in the place of that man in the square. By now, for that real or hypothetical past of his, he's excluded. He cannot stop. He must go to another city where another of his past awaits him, or something perhaps that had been a possible future of his and is now someone else's present. Futures not achieved are only branches of the past, and dead branches. Right? Thank you.
have a short moment, maybe for one or two questions. Yes, please.
In Singapore, you also have a waterfront. You have the sea. What is the influence of this waterfront and the sea for the inhabitants? I'm coming from Lucerne, and we have a lake, and we also have a waterfront.
Well, we're surrounded by water, so Singapore is an island. We reclaim a lot of our coastal areas to expand our land. So we have a lot of land reclamation. But in the city, of course, today we are building a brand new city we call this area the Marina Bay area, where we have the inner city, the existing city is really bursting at its seams. So more than 20 years ago, we have actually started reclaiming the land around. So today we are actually trying to use as much of our waterfront as possible for the new, in this case, the new city. But we have in the past been also very, very conscious that we need the waterfront for our port, because we are a major port city. And then a lot of the coastal areas, we have what we call the estuarine reservoirs, where the seawater goes in to these rivers. So we have dammed up a lot of the rivers and flush out the salt water, so they become freshwater reservoirs. So this is the kind of a usage of the sort of the coastal area, the estuarine reservoirs, the coastal port, then the Marina Bay, and then some of the industrial areas. So the water ages are actually very, very well used and very much treasured in Singapore. Yes.
Well, okay. One more question. Fine.
Can you tell us something about the happiness? This high density, does it lead to high happiness? There have been many studies. I can very well imagine that you might have inquired with the Singaporeans if they are happy with the Singaporean way of life. Like gross national product, let's say gross national happiness. Where do the Singaporeans fare?
We talk a lot about that in our center as well. But I think there are two aspects to it. Singaporeans are grumblers. They like to grumble. They like to complain. And happiness has got to do with aspiration. If you want something better and you're not there yet, you're unhappy. So it's not so much to do with your current state. Very often it is aspirational. And when we ask people about the Singaporeans are very future conscious. You ask them and they will say, I want this and I want that and I want that, So there is that level of wanting something. But it is not to do with not being satisfied with the existing environment. And when you ask, we spend a lot of time with these walk-through surveys and things like that, and people say they're actually quite use the word thankful to the government for providing them with the kind of housing, and they like the amenities. And one of the good things about Singapore is that it has a very central location. So we don't have our own hinterland, but we have a regional hinterland. So weekends, people get out. They go to Malaysia, they go to Batam, they go out. So we have that ability to actually move out, and I think that helps a lot when we talk about things like urban stress. I like to get out of the country as much as possible. When I come back, you appreciate it a lot more. So I think the smallness of the town really does not define people's aspirations and also confine their search for other ways of improving their well-being.